Okay, well, bore da iawn I chi. Good morning. Welcome to this question time event on the way forward for Wales's green recovery. How do we make sure it delivers for nature, for people, for the economy? My name's Steffan Messenger. I'm environment correspondent for BBC Wales News, and very pleased that with me this morning we have a cross-party panel of senior politicians to reflect on some of the themes and the issues that have been raised throughout the discussions held at this festival, and ever mindful, of course, of that upcoming Senedd election in May. This is a real opportunity now on the final day of what's been a really brilliant event to see how the parties propose to turn the talk of the last few days into action and policies and laws. And if the panelists have any policies they want to float past us today or even announce here at the Green Recovery Wales Festival, of course, we're all ears, and I'd encourage them to do that. This session is ultimately about what in real life practical terms is going to happen next. So before we get stuck in with questions, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves very briefly, name, party and role, please. And we'll start with Andrew.
First one to Mr. Mute button. Andrew R.T. Davis, Welsh Conservatives, Assembly Member, was until recently the Environment and Rural Affairs spokesperson, now the Health and Social Care spokesperson.
Llyr.
Yes, Llyr Griffith, Plaid Cymru Member of the Senedd for North Wales and Shadow Minister for the Environment and Rural Affairs.
William.
Bore da, I'm William Powell. I was formerly Assembly Member for Mid West Wales between 2011 and 2016. I'm a Powys County Councillor and a partner in the family farm here in the Black Mountains.
Anthony.
Anthony Slaughter, hi, Leader of Wales Green Party.
And finally, Hugh.
Hi, good morning. Hugh Ranker Davis, Welsh Labour and Cooperative Member for Ogmore, and a list of your arm as former positions that I've held, including UK Environment Minister way back when.
Well, thank you very much. We've had a sizable number of questions submitted already ahead of today's event. Too many, I think, to get through in an hour. So I've tried to group some of them together. There's also an opportunity for those of you watching online to ask questions, to comment as we go along. We'll be monitoring the feed under this YouTube broadcast, and we'll try and get your questions in. So please do get in touch. To get us started, though, we've asked all of the panelists to sum up in no more than a minute what they think will be the most important element of a green recovery for Wales. And I'll start on this one, please, with William Powell of the Liberal Democrats.
Well, Welsh farming at the moment, just emerging from the COVID crisis and with the twin uncertainties and difficulties associated with Brexit and the potential for no deal Brexit, as well as the ever-present threat of climate change, has very significant challenges ahead, but also we have major opportunities. In two occasions in the past century, after the First and Second World Wars, we had a fundamental reappraisal of the position of farming and food security. On this occasion, particularly with the publication of the 2019 report on the state of nature, we've got an additional and very important challenge that we need to embed, and that is to enable a green recovery. And we need to develop a partnership approach and a positive one to make sure that we're using this potential triple crisis to the benefit of Wales and our environment.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, Llyr Griffith, Plaid Cymru.
Yeah, thank you. The most important element, I think, of a green recovery has to be political will, because it's political will that drives change, and sometimes public opinion can lead that, and sometimes public opinion has to follow. And I think if COVID-19 has taught us anything, I think it's taught us that government interventions really matter, and that big change is possible if the political will is there. Now, clearly we can have a debate as to whether Wales has sufficient powers and sufficient resources to affect the change that we want to see at a scale and at a pace that we certainly feel is required and necessary. But even within the current settlement, I think there's much more that we can do. But without the political will to make that change happen, then it isn't going to happen.
Thanks, Llyr. Moving to Andrew Davies, Welsh Conservatives.
Thank you, Steffan. I think the most important thing is to take people with you. I mean, it's so easy to forget that ultimately people's views change over time. And what we have to constantly keep reminding people is that this benefits everyone and we all have a role to play. And if politicians don't keep the confidence of the people in what they're proposing to do, then ultimately agendas change and change quite dramatically. And as other speakers have said, COVID has given us this opportunity to reflect on maybe some new dynamics that we can bring into the system that will recognise our role as policymakers and with the toolbox that we have in the Welsh Parliament now, both on tax measures, but also in the field of planning and transport and business development. And so actually, rather than being an impotent institution, the Welsh Parliament has a huge range of opportunities to really shape an exciting agenda ahead over the next 5 years. And with the Assembly at the parliamentary elections next year, those opportunities should be grasped with both hands. But what's critical is that people are taken along with the agenda and realise that we all have a role to play.
Thank you. Hugh Iranca-Davies, Welsh Labour.
Thanks, Steffan. I think for me, we have learned lessons from COVID, but actually what we really need to do is get on with implementing in a meaningful, deep and meaningful way right across society the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act in Wales. It was landmark legislation. We now need to make it happen. And that means making the right decisions and sometimes tough decisions. Let me give some practical examples within a minute there. Into bringing together landscape management, biodiversity, climate change, farming, food production all together and agreeing where our destination is on this and how we should be doing things differently. Developing green economy and jobs, both on foundational level, local jobs, local communities, with development of things such as energy retrofits and so on at a scale we've never seen before, but also the bigger impacts as well. Modal shift, not just active travel, but actually genuinely getting out of our cars and doing things differently. And it'll be different in different parts of Wales, rural Wales from urban Wales as well. But fundamentally, doing this together in line with the Future Generations Act, actually doing this stuff together, getting everybody on board, and then making the right decisions, not just the tough decisions. We've shown we can do it through COVID. We've shown we can do it before. It's a very Welsh way of doing things.
Thank you. And just finally, for opening remarks, Anthony Slaughter, Wales Green Party.
I think this is a very welcome event these last few days because we're living in no doubt really challenging times. I mean, we saw 2020 start with large sections of the planet on fire, huge areas flooded, including here in Wales. And it underlined the climate emergency is real and the climate emergency is now. And declarations at every level of government of a climate emergency are welcome, but we need real, genuine action. And COVID-19 following on has exposed the deep structural flaws within our society and the way we do run things. So I think moving forward, it has to be about how governments work, how governments interact with people. It has to be a conversation that involves everyone. Moving forward, how do we make a better future for Wales? I think one thing that's staring me in the face on my screen right now, and I'm quite embarrassed to be part of this, is we need to be inclusive. We need to be talking to everyone. And unfortunately, and this implicates me as much as everyone else, we do not look reflective of the wider society. A group of white males over a certain age discussing the future somehow sits uneasy with me. So I do think we need to widen discussions and get every section of the community talking.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks all for setting out your stalls there in the first place. Lots to get into, and indeed we do have some questions that will help us delve into some of the specifics that you mentioned there. I'm going to plough on then with our first question, which is submitted via the Green Recovery Wales website. It's a very important one because it's to do with money, how you pay for the changes you want to see. This questioner says the annual budget for environment and rural affairs in Wales amounts to around 4% of the total budget. Given that biodiversity, the resilience of ecosystems, clearly such importance for Wales's future and for the health and well-being of its people and livelihoods, what would be a more realistic proportion of the Wales budget for this sector? And it's something Sophie Howe, who we heard from earlier, has raised also in terms of how much of the budget's devoted to decarbonisation. Hugh Iranca-Davies, going forward, will we be seeing, do you think, an increase in these departmental budgets, as it were, the environment and climate change and so on, at the expense of other areas?
I don't think it's at the expense, because one thing that we've learned already is that actually if you invest upstream of this, you save costs further down the line. So if you look at what we've learned with the falling in love that people have done again with the natural environment during COVID, and the mental health and well-being aspects of literally going out in your community, going for a walk, good local footpaths and proper investment in maintaining the rights of way network, let alone long distance trails. Now that's just one example. So really we do, but it isn't a 4% or a 2%. This is not like international development budgets allocating a certain amount of UK government, because surely this should reach right across government. It's how we invest in community transport. How do we invest in decentralized health and social care? All of those aspects have an effect on rural communities. What do we do in investing in the language? So rather than pick an arbitrary 4% and say it should be 5 or 6 or 7, let's talk about a proper joined up way of saying, how do we move the investment across government upstream to achieve all those benefits? If, for example, we're going to transform the way we do food, so we move much more towards what we see in other parts of Europe, local food networks. That takes a change of direction in funding to enable that to happen, and away from what we're currently doing. But you save money in the long run, and you boost the economy in doing it.
Okay, thank you. Anthony Slaughter, are you a fan of that approach in terms of a cross-government approach, or do we need more clearly defined spending pots on stuff that helps the environment? I mean, is it symbolic when you increase the budget for environment and climate change, for instance?
It's certainly symbolic, but I would agree with you that it sort of cuts across everything. It's how do you identify in every aspect of policy impacts on the climate emergency and green future. So I think whilst having a figure of 4% does look insufficient and should be more, I think it's not so much having a specific target, but spending the money that needs to be spent. And I think that's the one thing we have learned in COVID-19 is the magic money tree was there when it was needed. And I think it has to be the same approach to the climate emergency. We have to keep stressing that word emergency. So you don't, if your house is on fire, you don't sort of plan a budget for 10 years down the road about how you're going to fix it. You fight that fire there and then. So I think there needs to be an increase in money spent, but it needs to come across all departments and cover every area of policy, I would say.
Llyr Griffith, is it really possible to spend on a green recovery without other parts of government business losing out?
No, it's not. Sorry, not losing out, but contributing. That's what I thought you were going to say, but you said losing out. No, I mean, I'd be a big advocate, for example, of allocating a certain percentage of the health service budget being invested in those measures, for example, in green spaces and giving people the opportunity to enjoy the outdoors and to experience, carry on experiences, some of the newfound experiences that people have realised are on their doorstep following the lockdown experience, because it has clear benefits in terms of people's health and mental health particularly. You could say the same in relation to retrofitting homes. You know, if you tackle cold and damp homes, it's been shown to save millions of pounds to the health service. And if we are serious about implementing the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in the way that we do government and do spend in Wales, then clearly, you know, it's those kinds of investments that we need to see happening across government. Now, of course, I'm in a privileged position here because I chair the Finance Committee in the Senedd, and we obviously lead the charge in terms of scrutinising the government's budgets, and we always struggle with burrowing beneath the top lines of budgets. You know, the sort of NHS, you know, £7 billion for the NHS, and then, you know, you're really struggling for finer detail sometimes. So pinpointing where that money goes is difficult, and I think it would be a logistical challenge. But certainly in terms of my membership of the Environment Committee in the Assembly, we're constantly, and other colleagues will know, we're constantly asking the Finance Minister and the Environment Minister to try and be more clear and more definitive in being able to make the connection between the investment and the outcomes that they're looking for. Because if you can't do that, then you can't really be sure that the money's being spent in the way that it needs to be spent. But it isn't only, of course, utilising the budget that we have. We need to be more creative as well in identifying additional funding streams. And certainly, I think there's a big piece of work in terms of utilising various pension schemes and, you know, borrowing powers that we have, and looking at various opportunities in terms of levies and taxation. And I know there's been talk of environmental bonds in the past. I think we really need to be more creative as well in the way that we generate revenue in order to invest.
Thanks. I suppose what I'm trying to get at here, William Powell, is, what I'm stealing a question here from David Henshaw of NRW, who was chairing a session on Monday. There must surely be things that we don't do going forward, that we don't pay for, in order to have the green recovery that all of you want. What sorts of areas, do we stop doing to be able to pay for all of this?
I think it's a call really for ruthless prioritization. Given my own recent experience, I referred in the preamble in the green room, in the virtual green room, to my recent experience of putting a certain amount of burden on the NHS budget with my own 6-week stay in Neville Hall following a COVID journey, and so therefore I'm reluctant to put too much downward pressure on the NHS budget. But it's clear to me that what we do need to see is we need to identify the areas where there's real synergy and scope for partnership working, and as Hugh Aranka said, in terms of making the spend early so as to save further down the track. And I think it's not so much a question of moving out of areas of spend as seeing effective partnership. But one thing that was reflected in a recent report by the Auditor General was we need to bear down on inefficiencies and on the tendency that sometimes has occurred in the past for a rather bloated approach to administration and not sufficient emphasis on outcomes. And I think what we need to see in terms of agri-environment schemes in going forward is a more sort of granular approach to evaluating their outcomes, because that's something that we absolutely need, because there's no point in just measuring things by the amount of spend that you're making, but it's what you achieve at the other end. And that's something that we need to put more emphasis on than we have just in recent years.
Okay, finally, Andrew R.T. Davis, let me just put to you, for example, I'm interested perhaps in your party's support for the M4 Relief Road, a huge investment. Can we have that and also pay for a green recovery?
I believe you can, and the Imperial Inspector identified that as being a deliverable project which sat within the environmental goals of the Welsh Government. But ultimately, the First Minister took a different view from the Appeal Inspector in that particular instance. But going back to the original question, how do you increase money into the green agenda? What we've also got to remember is there are huge independent funds out there which are looking to invest in countries that pioneer green initiatives and drive their economy in the green environment. And so what we've got to be doing is not just looking at what government can spend, although that's important because it sets a target, but levering in pension funds and investment funds that have ethical basis for their investors, and bring that money into Wales as well, so that we can drive the economic benefits of the green revolution, as well as obviously taking sanctions where sanctions need to be taken to drive people along the journey that we want to be carbon neutral by 2050. It is easy to almost pluck figures out of the air and say, well, X number of 100 million should be spent there, X number of billion should go there. But what we do know is trying to turn the great ship of state around is a very tricky situation, very tricky vehicle to try and navigate, because so much of that money is already predetermined. If you take the health service, for example, so much is fixed in fixed costs already that actually look at discretionary spend, there's not a lot of money left over for that discretionary spend. But if we had a Clean Air Act, for example, that promised to deliver clean air wherever you lived in Wales, you'd be losing 2,000 premature deaths a year, as well as all the other complications that come in with dirty air and polluted air. And there are measures that government can take in the legislative framework, as I've just outlined there with the Clean Air Act. But I'm a big believer in not just looking at government spend, but looking at independent funds that are available, that are willing to invest in countries that do promote a green agenda and a green economy. And that can create a huge footprint for us to be punching way above our weight. Take agriculture, for example. Every pound of public money that goes into agriculture returns about £7.40 in dividends back to the rural economy.
Okay, Llŷr wants to come back in.
Very briefly then, it's just to say as well, of course, it isn't necessarily additional money, because we spend about £5 billion a year in Wales on public procurement. And we need to look at introducing strong carbon efficiency standards within public procurement. We need to look at what we use for construction in public construction. We need to look at more EV vehicles, for example, within the public sector. We need to look at shorter food supply chains, through local procurement, and all that has positive economic outcomes, has positive environmental outcomes. And of course, we're not spending a penny more. It's just being more clever in the way that we spend money that's already being spent.
Okay, and just quickly, Hugh, before I move on to the next question.
Yeah, one of the useful things that this first question has flushed out is the need to focus on outcomes, not just penny pieces. Penny pieces are always very, very important to make sure you have efficient spend. But William and I have been involved over the last 12, 15 months on a project looking at regional investment for Wales post EU withdrawal. And a massive focus of that work has been on outcomes. Now, if we agree that the outcomes are the different types of things that all the panelists here have been talking about, that ends up in very different decisions on spending. And then the question becomes, who should make those decisions? And we are adamant that it should be within a Welsh framework about the climate emergency, the biodiversity emergency, and all those things, but it should also then be regional and local determination, handing back to people the ability to say, in my area, in Ceredigion, in Powys, in Gwynedd, we think these are the priorities to achieve those issues of air quality, modal shift, and sustainable.
Okay, thanks everyone. Lots of questions coming in via the live feed under the YouTube broadcast. I'm going to move on to another question now, a bit of a change in gear. Living in a rural area, I'm very aware of its value for everyone's well-being, but how can we tackle threats to it from irresponsible users, particularly littering and off-road biking? Obviously a very timely question given the scenes that we've seen in Snowdonia in recent days. William Powell, a problem in Powys as well. What would you do about it?
Very much so, and I know over the course of the last weekend, there's been some really good work both in Southeast Wales with Gwent Police working in partnership with community groups, and in my area of Powys in terms of some off-road activities, and also a big spike in fly tipping. I think one thing we need to see is a more robust approach to enforcement and follow-up, and not getting too caught up in why we can't do that, because I think it's really important to make an example of people, as well as trying to use it's a sort of carrot and stick approach. Really, we need to develop a greater understanding of the impact, and there is a role here for restorative justice. I think one vehicle that would be very useful for a greater environmental and countryside voice are our local service boards, which of course is one of the main delivery mechanisms for the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I think we need to have more emphasis around that table, or that virtual table as it is just now, to promote more partnership working. But people certainly applaud that. And I was really touched late last night to get a message from somebody in my own ward in Talgarth, a young person, who basically with a group of friends had gone out into the park wood, which overlooks the town, and had actually undertaken a small spontaneous litter pick. And the warmth and regard with which people in our area were responding to his initiative was absolutely heartwarming. So I think it's a mixed approach, but we need to celebrate good practice, but crack down hard where we can on persistent offenders.
Thank you. Crack down hard. Andrew Arty-Davies, do you agree?
I agree. Living in a semi-rural area, if you like, just outside Cardiff, the last month or so has just been one big blight of litter from takeaways. If you pull into any of the car parks around any of the takeaway facilities that exist on most urban areas, they are just awash with litter. And it cast my mind back to when I first went into the Assembly in 2007. One of the first jobs that I had the privilege of doing was listening to a petition about plastic bags and making a charge on plastic bags. And if you actually cast your memory back, you used to see plenty of them blowing in the wind, you did, stuck in hedgerows or in the gutter or whatever. Now it's a very rare exception, because that's where taxes can be used effectively to change people's outlook on the responsibility they have to the environment. And one of the things I believe in very strongly is that takeaways need to take a far greater role by putting registration numbers on bags and all the stuff that they give, so that ultimately that can be traced back to the owner of the vehicle. If I drive the lane leading to my farm this morning, I will find 2/3 McDonald's, KFC wrappers just in the hedgerows. I have no idea who's done that. Now, we've got the technology to do that. So as policymakers, let's get on and do it. Likewise, with bottle returns, plastic bottles are another bane of most people's lives. I fail to see why we can't be more punitive in that particular area as well. And as someone who tried to bring this in back in 2014, I think it was, in the last Assembly, the deposit return scheme. Here we are in 2020, we still haven't got that. So it's all well and good having tea and biscuits and saying that we need to take action, but actually we do have the tools. Let's get on and do something about this.
I can see you nodding there, Shira. It sounds like the vehicle registration option is going to be Welsh Conservative policy. Is it going to be Plaid Cymru policy? I know I was reading an article about a petition by one of your branches on this.
You stole my thunder. Plaid Cymru and Blaenau Gwent have actually launched a petition about 2 months ago on this, because once those businesses were emerging from lockdown, once we saw the takeaways sort of reopening, all of a sudden we also saw a corresponding increase in the blight of littering. So I think there is something that needs to happen there. And of course, much of this is within the gift of the Welsh Government, because we've been talking, as Andrew said, for years and years about deposit return schemes, about extended producer responsibility, about banning single-use plastics, and all of those are things that we really should decisively move to address. We've been talking about them since I became an Assembly member back in 2011, and we're still talking about them now, which is unfortunate. So I think, we need stronger enforcement. Yes, of course we do. But I think it's also about education and educating people to understand, what actually is happening here. And much of this can be done through community initiatives. I think of, the Llangattock team that are sort of constantly on social media highlighting the excellent work that they do there in terms of litter picking and creating a greater awareness amongst the community as well. So there is a lot that we can do, and you mentioned sort of parking and that, we need to just develop alternatives, be they park and rides or more public transport. The answers are there, it's just having the will to do it and put it into action.
Hugh Ranker-Davies address that point about, why are we still waiting for a bottle return scheme and all of those other measures in terms of plastics, because there have been many consultations, we've been talking about it for a long time. Why haven't we got one yet?
It's a good question. I think it's probably gone on a bit too long, but I'd refer everybody to the consultation that's been out there now, I think for about the last 2 months, that Hannah Blythe, the Minister, actually launched. And it is massively ambitious. So it looks at how to actually end the use of single-use plastics. It looks at developing a much more robust circular economy. And it touches on actually most of the aspects that have been talked on, with one exception, which I have a degree of sympathy with, I have to say. It's the zeitgeist moment. It's that thing to do with takeaways and registration plates. Could it be put on the packaging as well as the receipts and so on? Because I came back yesterday from a charity walk down in Tenby, did a fantastic 18 miles in the sunshine. When I got back home, checked then on my social media to find that in half a mile from my house back here, we've somebody who is fly tipped across a country lane there. It's an absolute mess. Now, so we have two things going on. One is that people are really getting out more into the countryside. We're starting to develop, and I welcome this, more of an outdoor approach with people. We have this great green playground outside in all parts of Wales. I'm in the South Wales valleys. We walk straight up onto the hills here if we choose to make use of it. But at the same time, we've got people who don't understand how to use that responsibly. So I'd take a slightly different nuance from perhaps Andrew in what he was saying. I think there is a role definitely for enforcement and for fixed penalty fines for people and for so on. But there's a real opportunity here to educate, engage and inform with people, because the days have gone from when I used to walk up in the Brecons, and if I saw 20 people on that day, that would be a busy, busy day. Now you go to the top of Penavon, it's like a motorway. So I head elsewhere. Now there's a real opportunity here actually to engage with people for the physical and mental health well-being aspects and say, This is how you responsibly use the countryside. And of course, one of the big downsides at the moment that we're seeing is all the stuff around wild camping. Now, we don't have wild camping here officially within Wales, but people have done it over the years. You know, they pitch up late at night, they disappear in the morning, nobody's ever known they've done that. We have some, long distance trail walkers who've done it, and you never know that they're there. But what we're now seeing on the back of COVID is groups of people, and it's not just youngsters, it's not youngsters, who are going into rural areas, going into the woods behind me, and then causing a hell of a mess and leaving it behind.
Okay,
We need to get that
must be
message
acting
out there about doing it.
on wild camping too.
Yeah.
Just finally, Anthony, what does the Green Party want to see on this?
I agree, it's been really depressing to see this, and it's not just been rural areas. I've seen it in rural areas in the Vale, but also Cardiff Bay was notoriously hit by this problem as well. And I think it's some allowance that perhaps people are a bit demob happy, but I think we do need a two-pronged approach. It needs enforcement and it needs education. There's no reason for not clamping down on people fly tipping and littering. And as the community lead on the Plastic Free Communities campaign here in Penarth, it's the whole Surfers Against Sewage campaign. We're very, very concerned at this step back, because communities across Wales were making real progress on educating people on this issue and tackling the use of single-use plastics. And others have already touched on, we've got to get those items out of the supply chain. They won't be littered if they're not there. And as I said, it was really frustrating. Lots of local businesses are on board, but now there's a big pushback from the plastics industry saying only single-use plastics are safe in the current climate. So we need to tackle that, and that needs legislation. But I also think on the education aspect, people wouldn't abuse countryside if they cherished it. People need to know more about the countryside. We need more nature education at a younger age. People need to know what it is. It's not just a playground or playing field. And once people begin to appreciate, and because as others have said, as Hugh said, it isn't just for a few of us to use, it should be for everyone to use, but everyone needs to be using it responsibly and respectfully. And I think education has a key part to play in that.
Okay.
Again, down to the number plate question, I think that would have limited effect, but whether the resources would be there to enforce it efficiently is another question. So again, I hope we'll see a downturn. I hope it was just a sort of demob spike, but it really does need tackling.
Brilliant. I know people want to come back in, but I'm going to plough on because we've got about 7,000 questions to get through in half an hour. So the third question that's come in is, what are the panellists' proposals? Let's try and do this in a quick 5 minutes. What are the panellists' proposals for reversing nature declines in Wales? 1 in 6 species studied as part of the latest State of Nature report at risk of disappearing from Wales. I'll come back to you if you don't mind, Anthony. Slaughter, what would you do?
Increased community engagement would be key, getting community growing schemes, community orchards, planting. Again, it's education, getting communities involved, putting the resources there, more tree planting. We have ambitious targets here in Wales, and it's really depressing to see that we're getting nowhere near them. And planting more trees should be the easy picking fruit when it comes to hitting targets. So there are lots of people out there. I'm involved with several community groups planting orchards and community growing schemes. Empower those people, give those people the resources they need.
Thank you. Llyr?
Yeah, I think education is key, and I think the new curriculum in Wales has a key role to play in that respect. We need to make sure that people do reconnect and re-engage with nature. We've seen, I think, the benefit of that reconnection emerging in recent months, and we certainly need to build on that and really entrench that and ingrain that in our younger generations, and that includes sort of relinking the understanding of where food comes from, for example. We certainly need to look at greater investment, which brings us back to the first question, really, across government. I think all departments have a role to play in realising the restoration of the stopping of decline that we all want to see. There are certainly issues around the need to collaborate across different sectors. Again, there's talk of targets as well, and I've pushed back slightly against those, because the danger is that once you set targets, you think you've done it. You think you've done the hard work, and it might be difficult to sort of really get meaningful targets. But certainly I'm open to that, because I think it does change the mindset once you do set targets. Yeah. And they need to be aspirational targets as well, because I think there are too many people trying to get halfway up a mountain and making it. I think we need to aim for the peak, and we might not get there, but we get further than halfway.
And that's definitely been a feature in some of the other sessions, is calls for targets in terms of reversing nature loss. Andrew, what would the Welsh Conservatives do in terms of that?
Well, if I draw on the urban analogy in the first instance, then move to the countryside. I mean, we launched the Livable Cities document some 2.5 years ago now, and in that, at the heart of that document, was about creating the green environment within our urban areas, because this isn't just about the countryside. This was about creating a green canopy within our urban areas, roof gardens, water capture, transport options, and genuine options rather than paper exercises. And that document has been there now for 2.5, 3 years. So people can look at that and test our credentials. When it comes to the countryside, I do think it's really important to try and look at what we've done wrong in the past and then shape the future. And with Brexit and the powers that are coming back to the Welsh Assembly or the future Welsh Government, those powers are going to be pretty immense, to say the least. I, as a farmer, was involved in an environmental scheme back in 2004, I think it was, for 10 years, called Tig Gofal. And I happen to think it was an excellent scheme. When I look at the changes it made on our own farm, it allowed us to carry on producing food whilst also creating huge areas of habitat and forestry plantation as well. We put in about 5.5, 6 acres of woodland on the farm. Where I'm a little cautious about targets from any government of whatever colour is that very often these targets are set long into the future and then ultimately get missed by a country mile. And I talk about woodland planting as an example here in Wales. You know, to be fair to the previous Welsh governments, they had very ambitious targets. I think it was first of all 4.5 to 5,000 hectares a year. Then it was scaled back to 2,000 hectares. Listen to this, they had 80 hectares last year, they did. So it's all well and good having the target, but you also need to resource it and you also have to have the pipeline of delivery. And I think that's where I'm careful on targets, because it's very often the minister of whatever colour this is standing at the dispatch box saying, well, we'll do this in 10 years, we'll do this in 15 years, because this is a generational project. And it's easy for the minister to say it'll take a generation to change it. So I think there's real solutions there from what we've done wrong in the past. And I draw people's attention to our Livable Cities document for urban areas, but also some of the schemes that I think have been successful, such as Tig Gofal, that going forward we can look at when we shape the new land-based policy that the next government in the Assembly will have to deliver for farmers across Wales.
Okay, a couple more minutes on this. I need to get William and Hugh in. William Powell, what would you like to see happen to reverse nature declines?
I think Anthony's point was a powerful one around addressing the increasing sort of divide that there's been between urban and rural, and promoting a greater understanding. I think part of that is perhaps because of the way in which farming in more recent years, mechanized farming, has taken on a bigger scale, and we're no longer in a situation where townsfolk and villagers can sort of get involved and pitch in at key times, such as harvest time, which when I was in my teens and so on was very much the case. But we need to be proactive in that approach. But I think we also need to learn from some of the best practice. Andrew referred just now to Tir Gofal and certain support mechanisms that were mentioned just yesterday in the Hedges and Edges session of the Green Recovery Festival, because there are smaller but significant contributions that can be made by, for example, promoting the approach of double fencing to protect hedgerows so that they grow and develop and become a better habitat, and also little pockets of forestry planting at the edge of arable fields. One other thing, I'm conscious that we're very close on time, is the very positive example that I picked up from your report from last autumn on the National Trust farm at Brasili, in terms of the bumblebee development, going from, in a particular area, 2,000 to 250,000 bumblebees in a period of 2 years through making certain adjustments. And I think that can be replicated elsewhere across Wales, because pollinators, for example, are also really, really important.
Yeah, I remember visiting that site, and as you say, it's very striking. Just finally then, Hugh, we are going to move on to talk about farming. So yeah, what would you do about reversing nature declines?
First of all, it'd be really good if going into the election, every single political party in Wales had an explicit commitment to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and to tackle climate change. I think that would put us all heading for the same headline outcome. Then we actually need to put in place the things that would do that, and that would include the work that's been going on over the last 2.5 years of working with farmers, landowners, environmentalists on a different approach to post-EU funding for both food farming and land management at a scale, so that we put into practice that idea of how do we reverse biodiversity loss that we're having at a pace in Wales, but also across the UK and across most of the developed world as well there. We should also look at what we can do with increased forestry as part of this, and it is to do with the right tree in the right place, and that means the right trees in urban environments, and also development on farming and other land where appropriate, and the right sort of trees that can actually lead to jobs in woodland management. But part of this as well, I think I'm really excited about the proposals around a South Wales Valleys regional forest. Now that will be phenomenal. We always underestimate the South Wales Valleys and their contribution, but I can walk from here to Cwmbran, right across the mountaintops, the Bulch Mountain and beyond, and we should be looking at more there with the appropriate woodland coverage as well, so other people can enjoy it. I don't have enough time to answer all the things that could turn this around, but make it an explicit commitment and then allow that commitment to prioritize the way you make individual decisions. And that does mean in farming, a different type of approach that works with farmers, landowners, environmentalists to agree how they will take a different approach. You've heard already from panelists, and I've seen it myself, I've been involved in them, the writing of some of the best schemes of how you combine environmental management and food production. But it's wider than that. It's everything we do. It's how we do sustainable communities along the M4 strip and along the A55 in North Wales. So people have to travel less, can live in good communities with good jobs closer to home. All of that as well.
Okay, just picking up on something you said there, just about forestry. I mean, Andrew mentioned there, you know, in the last planting season, only 80 hectares of trees planted in Wales. The target's been 2,000 for years, and you know, others like the Committee on Climate Change should be planting 5,000. I mean, how are you going to get to that target? Very briefly.
You only do it by putting the fiscal incentives in place, and I don't think we've had them right. There have been some really good schemes in the past, like Tir Coed and others, that have really incentivized farmers and landowners to do it. But we need to talk as well about how you incentivize community planting. So right outside here in the 2-mile radius, we have one of the landmark schemes in Wales, the biggest NRW scheme of community planting called Spirit of Llinvi Woodland. And it's been done with the GPs, the local primary schools and everybody else. So line up the fiscal incentives so that it makes it worthwhile, as well as feeling good about doing it. And we haven't quite done it. So I hope any government going forward now will make it financially worthwhile for people to do it. And sorry, just final point, it's got to be the right type of woodland cover in the right place.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Let's move on, because loads of the questions that are coming in on live, as it were, are to do with farming and farming policy going forward. What about a truly integrated food and farm strategy? How do you see communities playing their role in the future of farming in Wales? Does the panel believe we have a responsibility to deliver sustainably produced, climate responsible food? So we know that one of the big pieces of legislation that will have to be brought before the next Senedd is an agriculture bill, hugely significant, of course, in terms of a green recovery, in terms of how farmers are paid and how the landscape is supported and protected in the future. Let me ask each of you very briefly what your agriculture bill will look like. Let's start, I'll go back to Hugh Ranker-Davies. If you could summarise, please, what the Welsh Government's proposals are very briefly, and also perhaps answer why we haven't seen a bill yet.
So, because partly with the post-Brexit EU transition, there was a decision made to actually leapfrog on the UK agricultural bill in order to deliver some of the powers that we actually need, but it isn't a substitute for a Wales-specific Made in Wales agricultural bill. And also a Made in Wales, I have to say, agricultural food and land management bill. Now, Lesley Griffiths, the minister, has spelled out very, very clearly what this should entail, and it should be a different approach, working with farmers and others to actually develop those more public goods as well as the food production. And those public goods will include things such as water management, reducing nitrate leachage onto land. Could be things like public access, and I declare an interest as one of the vice presidents of Ramblers Cymru as well in this. But it's a different approach working with farmers and landowners to deliver that. So Leslie has set out very clearly what a Welsh Labour approach would be to that. But in order to do it, we actually need the powers to be delivered to Wales and to bring forward a bill in the start of the next Senedd to make this happen. There's a lot of good work being done on the ground already. It won't be easy because, you know, if you grab a lot of people in a room with slightly different agendas, there's tough, you know, discussions to be had. But I'm convinced we can do it because we've already had some amazing best practice in Wales.
Okay, Anthony, what have you made of the proposals, and what would a Green Party agriculture bill look like?
It's quite good timing because we're actually working on that at the moment. We've been in quite a lot of discussions with various representatives from the agriculture industry. And I've actually got a session this afternoon, which we're going to try and thrash out some key policies. I mean, we want to see things, it's really got to be working with the sector. We'd like to refocus subsidies, but working with farmers to figure out how we best do that to get the outcomes that we all want. We're also keen on things like security of tenure, making it easier for families to stay on farms. But key to our vision really is as much a localized food economy as much as possible. Obviously, it can't be 100%, but we want to see communities reconnecting with the food that they eat, where it's grown. It goes back to what's been mentioned earlier, that lack of communication now between, you know, you've got rural agriculture community over there and everyone else over here, and the two don't talk to each other and they don't know what's going on. So we'd like to see more, again, it's education, getting people involved in that. And it's all the key things really. It's about more sustainability, it's more cooperatively owned agriculture, and also more urban growing we'd like to see.
Okay, thanks, William.
I think one of the key things that we need to establish is that there is still a need for an overall sort of support basis for farmers at the festival wall, if you will, a form of universal basic income for farmers in exchange for, and it's got to be a robust exchange for environmental goods and services, as Hugh was just saying. We also need to realize the vital importance not just of farming, but also of the wider sort of food and drink sector and its importance to the Welsh economy, both domestically, but also in terms of our exports. And I am very attracted, and the Welsh Labour Democrats are attracted to the proposal by NFU Cymru to establish a commission for food and farming with an independent commissioner to hold to account decision makers in this area. I think there was great expectation of the grocery codes adjudicator back in the period after 2010, and there has been some delivery there, but we need to revisit that and to derive greater benefit from that kind of accountability, because it's all got to be based on outcomes. And clearly there's been so much flux in recent years. We also need to remind the Westminster government of its undertakings to not deliver a penny less in terms of funding to the custodians of the land and the custodians of the Welsh environment. And I, at the moment, am not entirely optimistic that is going to be adhered to. I also got great fears regarding the outcome of the recent trade bill, and I think that's another role why we need to have a strong commissioner and an independent commissioner to make those representations. Okay,
William Powell has great fears, Andrew Davies. How about you? And what would a Welsh Conservative agriculture bill look like?
William's always had great fears, he has, hasn't he? But me and him will never see eye to eye on Brexit and leaving the European Union. But if I was devising an agricultural bill at the moment, and obviously with the election coming, hopefully that will be in our manifesto, it would have two tenets to it. One, reversing habitat decline, and two, food security. And I don't think the two fight against each other. As a farmer myself, one thing that pleases me more than anything is to see vibrant habitats around the farm that I have the privilege to farm in my lifetime at the moment. And we have had a commitment from the Westminster government And the current First Minister, to his credit, has said that any money that does come via agriculture and the environment will stay within that envelope. And so we know that for the lifetime of the Westminster Parliament, we can bring forward schemes that will enhance the environment and habitat and reverse habitat decline here in Wales, whilst making sure we reverse the food security dilemma that we face at the moment. You know,
does that mean retaining an element of direct payments for farmers then?
Well, we've gone from food security of 75% to under 60% at the moment. And when you have a conversation with most members of the public, they look at the countryside as being the warehouse for that food, the production base for that food. And they are happy to make sure that money, public money, does go in to support vulnerable communities to the vagaries of the weather and all the other elements that you have when you're farming the land. And so we know that there's public support there. In an earlier contribution, I made the point that agriculture can show that for every pound that goes into agriculture, it returns about £7.40 worth back in public goods. So the record to date has been good, but sadly, we need to rebalance where we've been going wrong, and biodiversity and habitat decline has been one of the areas which the Common Agricultural Policy has exacerbated. And I believe that with a new agricultural bill coming in the next session, we can have the two. We can reverse biodiversity decline here in Wales, and also have food production at the heart of what we as a Welsh Government want to achieve, which is good, wholesome Welsh food on the shelves for Welsh consumers to buy.
Okay, thank you. Finally, Llyr Griffith, a Plaid Cymru agriculture bill. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there's much of what's being proposed actually that we support, particularly in terms of payment for public goods. I think that's a perfectly legitimate proposal in terms of investing in those people who have the ability and the tools to make a difference in terms of biodiversity and in terms of flood mitigation and carbon capture and all of those aspects that farmers can actually contribute to. And very often farmers are seen as the problem, whereas in fact farmers are part of the answer. And I think that's an important distinction to make. Where I do fundamentally disagree with the government, though, is that I would want to retain at least an element of a universal basic income, as Bill described it, or some sort of direct payment. Now, the parameters around that direct payment clearly would need to be looked at, not only in terms of ensuring the highest standards of public health and animal health and welfare, but also trying to make sure that can facilitate a greater shift towards more low carbon and high nature value farming. And I'm particularly attracted to the maximum sustainable output model, which is a model that's been mooted for a number of years. The default position for many farmers, if you're struggling, is to produce more. But of course, in order to produce more, you need more inputs, costs go up, and relative to cost, profits don't necessarily go up as much. So we need to be working with the land and not mining the land. And in my days as an employee of the National Trust before my election as a member of the Senedd, it was very much a big feature of the work at that time. We have been mining the land and not working sufficiently with the grain of nature. I do have concerns, though. If the Welsh Government is looking to implant effectively the RDP and the Glasstir model at a grander scale within any new model of support, then crikey, they're struggling to handle 3,000 contracts at the moment, let alone potentially 20,000 contracts in a few years to come. So there are big issues, I think, around having a capacity to deliver something at that scale. And one of the things I'd like to say as well is, we're all aware that the agricultural industry has committed itself to becoming carbon neutral by 2050. Well, if I was minister, I would want to sit down with the industry and why not have a similar aspiration in terms of the nature and ecological emergency that we're facing. If we can do it for carbon emissions, then surely we can do it for other things as well.
Okay, Andrew wants to come back in very, very quickly before we move on.
Just very quickly, it's a more of a general point, but it's the dilemma that we face at the moment with the fighting for the landscape that we've got in Wales. At the moment in this area of Wales, we've got huge demand for solar parks. Now, there's a big question, is land supposed to be for food production or is it supposed to be for energy production? Because if you take several hundred acres out at a time for the solar park, then ultimately that land is lost to food production. And it goes back to my opening gambit about taking people with you. There is a real challenge as to how we shape the landscape going forward and create that environment that actually takes people along this journey with us.
Okay, thanks everyone. This potentially might be our last question. I'll see if I can squeeze in any more, but if you could be quick with your answers. But I think it's quite an important one to finish with, because later on today there's a session with young people. And the question is, what will your party's green recovery offer for young people's prospects? We know young people are very engaged with the climate movement, have indeed led efforts to raise awareness in recent years. They're also some of the most badly affected by the economic downturn caused by coronavirus. Hugh Anker Davis, what will Welsh Labour's green recovery do for young people?
The discussion that's been going on within Welsh Government on how we build back post-COVID, which adds on to how we build back post-EU withdrawal as well, by the way, has been very much focused now on green infrastructure, green jobs, doing things differently. And when I mentioned it earlier on in some of my points, that idea of how do you build local jobs, jobs closer to home, sustainable communities where you have to travel less great distances for a wide number of jobs. That's a very different way, I have to say, about building back the economy afterwards. The biggest challenge that we know from the headlines every night on the news is the economic hit that we're going to have. That doesn't mean we have to go back to exactly what we were doing before. So if we choose to, we can actually invest in those local foundational economy jobs. We can invest in training and skills and apprenticeships, again, in a scale that we haven't done before. And we've done this before in Wales, by the way, because we've had some of the best UK schemes in terms of young people. And if we do it in line with the Wellbeing and Future Generation Act, which means that we think about this and future generations, then the focus has to be on young people as well, because they're going to inherit the decisions that we make right now. So I'm encouraged, I'm inspired by the thinking of young people now in terms of what they want to see out of life and also their awareness of environmental matters. That gives me real hope that we're set well for the future despite the challenges ahead.
Thank you. I heard in a previous session, I think it was Katie Jo Luxton of RSPB Cymru proposing the idea of a green task force for young people, offering them jobs on projects that boost the environment. I mean, does that sort of idea appeal to you, Anthony Slaughter?
Very much so. I mean, the first thing I'd say about what do we offer young people is we would listen to them. They need to be part of these discussions, these decisions. You just talked about them inheriting these decisions. Well, they need to be part of these decisions. I mean, I think the school strike for climate has shown that they've shamed our generation in their awareness of the need and the urgency. So I think they have to be part of the decision-making process. But yeah, the Green New Deal, which we've been talking about for a very long time, is offering better jobs, better lifestyles, not so work-focused, 4-day weeks. Other people have mentioned universal basic income. Our proposals would offer them a secure and a better way of life, a better quality of life. But as I keep saying, key to it is involving them in the decision-making process.
Thank you. Andrew R.T. Davis, why should young people vote Welsh Conservative at the next election? What are you going to do as part of this recovery for them?
Well, look at what we've said in this Assembly to what we want to achieve as a government in the next Assembly. Our Livable Cities document, a Clean Air Act, and above all, I've been watching what the French have done in introducing the Environment Act and putting forward a People's Assembly, which informed the development of that Environment Act. So it could go back to my opening remarks again, taking people with you. This isn't about talking to people and telling them what they need to do. Everyone needs to feel they have their part to play. And certainly in the political process, regrettably, young people feel that they have been excluded from that process. Well, that's why I think it's quite exciting to look at the development of what the French did before they brought the Environment Act forward, of putting a People's Assembly together and ultimately taking those views on board and informing the development of the legislation. So rather than looking back and saying, here's your piece of legislation, actually say, this is your legislation because you drafted it and you created it. And that's why I think if you look at what Welsh Conservatives have supported in this Assembly, what potentially we could do if we had the leaders of government in the next Parliament with dedicated pieces of legislation and delivery on key goals and key targets to make sure that it is everyone's revolution and everyone's green future.
Thanks, Llyr.
Yeah, well, Plaid Cymru recently announced actually a jobs guarantee for young people, and I didn't hear Katie Jo Luxton's contribution in a previous session, but it sounds as if that's exactly the kind of thing that we'd be keen to see young people being given the opportunity to do. But more widely, it isn't just about jobs. I mean, the green recovery I'd like to see would obviously gift young people a better future in terms of the environment that they live within, but also a more equal and just society that they live in, because the Green New Deal isn't just about the economy, isn't just about the environment. It's about putting an end to food banks, reducing suicides and being globally responsible. It sort of brings all of those elements together. And what I would say as well is that there was recent research by Oxford University, which measured the investment made following the 2008 crash. And it highlighted actually that investment in green projects actually creates more jobs. It delivers more higher short-term returns per pound spent by government, and it also leads to increased long-term cost savings. So it makes sense on all levels.
Thank you. And finally, William Powell, what would you do for young people? How will you make sure they benefit from the recovery?
Well, one of the things that we need to do is to ensure that some of the fantastic, enthusiastic and ambitious young people actually have access to the land, because without access, there's not a whole lot you can achieve. One thing that I think is really important is to establish a closer partnership between Welsh Government and local government in terms of the fantastic assets that certain of our councils, including my own in Powys, have retained, which is a level of local authority-owned farms. And what we need to do is to ensure that we have a moratorium on any future disposals of those, because I think they can be deployed in localities to give people access. We also need to ensure that there's a greater emphasis on rural vocational skills, because there is a danger that some of our young people seek courses beyond Wales, that some of the great sort of agricultural institutions outside Wales. We have plenty within, but certainly in the border territories, you've got people as my own son Harper Adams and Cirencester and elsewhere. Sometimes that will then lead to them developing links through work experience and recruitment that takes them away from Wales. And one thing that we need to address is that critical issue of rural depopulation. We need to give people hope, and we need to give people a means to both access the land and actually to use that access to everyone's benefit.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but thanks to all of the panelists for a very interesting discussion. Thanks for your policy suggestions. From my point of view, the hour's flown by, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to more questions. There are loads of themes that people were interested in, from national parks to energy use, Brexit, water use, all sorts of things that we haven't managed to discuss. But thanks again to all of the panelists, to Anthony Slaughter, William Powell, Andrew Davis, Llyr Griffith and Hugh Ranka-Davies for taking part. Thanks to Arfon at RSPB Cymru and Kate from the National Trust, who've been liaising with me about this session, and everyone else from the various organisations involved in the festival for your hard work. I hope you have a very good rest of the day and enjoy the other sessions, and thank you very much for watching.